Welcome back. So in this video, we're going to focus on the front end. We're going to be learning about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript on a high level. We're not actually going to be writing any code yet, but we're going to be seeing code for the very first time. So there are two big things you want to know, which is what's the difference between front end and back end, and also what's the difference between HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and what are their respective roles. So let's start by discussing front end versus back end. When I go to a URL, let's say I go to Facebook. Now, when I do this, I create a HTTP request asking for facebook.com, and that eventually goes to Facebook servers eventually. Then Facebook decides what page to send me back. So in the case of Facebook, it needs to figure out what images, what stories, how many likes do they have, what friends do I have, all the things pertaining to me, all my settings. It needs to send that back to me in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript so that my browser can display that for me. So this diagram here kind of explains the difference between front and back end, where everything that I get back and that I see in my browser is just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Just the tip of the iceberg. But this is what my browser sees, and it is the front end or the client side, and it is constructed by the back end. Everything else that happens, all the logics, figuring out if I'm logged in, figuring out who my friends are, all that comes from the back end or the server side logic. So you can see there's a lot more here. There's a lot of choices, so many technologies. On the front end, there's not. It's always HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But on the back end, you got different languages such as Python, PHP, Ruby, and JavaScript, which actually is what we're going to be using. There's different databases. You got Postgres, MongoDB, and CrouchDB, MySQL, SQLite. There's so many choices, so it's a little intimidating. We're going to definitely talk more about the backend when we get to that unit, but for now, just remember that the backend is what constructs HTML and CSS and sends it back. So let's take an example here. Here we have Spotify's page. Now, it is always the same. It is static. Well, I mean, it could be changed, but in order for it to be changed, the developer has to go into the HTML and manually change it. So basically, every time I refresh the page, I get the same home page. Every time I go on the help page, I get the same help page. I get the same premium page. That's not a bad thing, but it doesn't need to change. It's just about Spotify and its services. Google News, on the other hand, is dynamic. Every time I refresh the page, almost every 5 minutes, something changes on here. Whether it's the weather over here, NFL scores, and these are live updating, maybe it's a new story. Something changes. So this is very, very different every time, while this here is always the same. So again, the difference is two things. One is static page versus a dynamic page. Both of them are web pages. Both of them have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript coming back. One, however, is going to change based off some sort of server-side code, which is something on the back end. So now let's break down these three pieces: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We're going to go into a lot of details on each of those components in their separate sections and units, but HTML, let's start there, stands for Hypertext Markup Language. Basically, imagine that, and this is what actually happened in the early days of the internet, there was no standardized way to send information and to send documents. So initially, the internet was used to communicate between universities and colleges, and also used as a military tool. So let's say I wanted to send this to a friend. I need to say, this is bolded, these are little bullet points, and I've got some quotes surrounding this. I need a way to break that down and describe it to send it to someone else, and the solution was HTML. HTML is actually the easiest thing we're going to be learning in this course. Not to say that it is insanely easy, but it is simple in that we just describe what we want, and what you write is what you get. So HTML is often referred to as the nouns of a web page. It's the structure. Some people say the skeleton. Basically, you say, put an image here, put a bullet point here, put a heading here, put a slightly smaller heading here. It just allows you to describe the structure of a page. CSS, on the other hand, is how we describe the style of a page. I need HTML to use CSS. CSS on its own doesn't really do anything at all. Every single web page has HTML. Some web pages don't have CSS, and some don't have JavaScript. It's not mandatory, but HTML is. So CSS, cascading style sheets. We'll learn exactly where that name comes from in a little bit, but basically it styles existing HTML. So you can say things like make all those bullet points green, make the background pink, make the border yellow. It is sometimes considered to be the adjectives of a web page, or some people call it the skin to HTML's skeleton. The last piece here we have is JavaScript. Now, JavaScript is definitely the most complex thing out of these three. It's how we add logic and interactivity to a page. So with HTML and CSS, we can make a beautiful looking site, but it's not going to be able to do anything really. I mean, we can do simple animations, but we can't load data from anywhere else. We can't make things interactive. We can add logic, but with the JavaScript, we can. Here are some examples I have. Do math, change color when the user clicks, load new data from Twitter, get the current weather. So, I mean, if HTML is the nouns, CSS is the adjectives, then JavaScript is the verbs or the actions on a web page. I have this all wrapped up nicely in a code pen. We're not going to use a whole lot because we haven't really started writing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript just yet, but I'm going to use it as an example. And what this does is it just lets you write simple pages in the browser so we don't have to use your text editor, and I can share it with you very easily. So I have three sections: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Again, the code itself is not what's important here. It's the concepts. So let's take a look, and I'm just going to get rid of the CSS. I'm going to get rid of the JavaScript as well. So you can see we're left with this plain black and white structural material. Now I'm specifying my contents. So these are my words, and I'm wrapping these content in specific structural elements. And again, don't worry about the tags themselves. We're going to have a whole lot of videos ahead that are going to go into details on each one of these. But basically, this is saying make big text right here. This is a make a list, and make an individual list item that says make me a bullet point, and another one that says make me another bullet point, and then make a button that says make me a button here, as you can see. So on its own, that's just the structure. So now let's go add our CSS back in, and you can see what I'm doing here is I'm saying make the H1 here purple. So we can change that to green, and it changes to green. There we go. And I'm also saying make the button have a border, have a background color, and a text color of white. So we can change that to be a green text color, and I can give it a much bigger border of 20 pixels, as you can see there. So that's our adjectives, and the last piece is our JavaScript. So without JavaScript, this button does nothing. Now what I've done here is I've written JavaScript that says, hey, when the user clicks the button, pick a random color and then change the background color that we have here to that random color. So I'll show you that now. So I click and I got a random color each time. So if I got rid of this JavaScript and I try to do that again, you see here that nothing happens. That's because there aren't any verbs. It's just down to nouns and adjectives. It's just the structural skeleton and a little bit of skin on top. As I add my JavaScript in, I add the logic. So JavaScript is really important. Now, this is not exactly what you do on a production site, but you might build a site in the future that will require you to have some interactivity, and JavaScript adds that interactivity and logic. So again, I encourage you to play around on CodePen. You will have the link to this in the description down below so you can explore a little bit. There's no rush to move ahead to the next video, so you can just try changing some of these colors if you can. Don't focus too much on the code itself, just have fun playing around with it. There's no pressure to understand anything here aside from the high-level overview of what HTML does and what CSS does and what JavaScript does.